Ted Cruz, thank you so much.
Jack, great to be with you.
So, you've been very outspoken about what happened in Israel.
Yeah.
Talk to me about your reaction to the Hamas terror attacks, and you've been here in Dallas with the Jewish community.
Yeah.
So talk to me about that.
Well, what's happening in Israel is utterly horrific. This is the worst attack on Israel in over 50 years. On Saturday, we saw the greatest mass murder of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. We've got right now over 1,200 Israelis who have been murdered. We have 22 Americans who've been murdered. We have thousands upon thousands of Israelis who've been injured. We have hundreds, and we don't have a firm count of this, who've been kidnapped. It is absolute brutality. What we're seeing death squads literally going from home to home, murdering women, murdering children, murdering elderly people, decapitating infants. I mean, it is horrific and unspeakable. And these Hamas terrorists, they're targeting civilians. They're not going after military targets. They're not going after soldiers. They are going after children. They're brutally raping women and little girls. They're dragging them in the street as trophies. They're taking them back to Gaza to use as human shields. It is horrific. And it is critical that America stand with Israel, because Israel is responding, and they are going to utterly eradicate Hamas. They are going after the Hamas leadership, the terrorists, their weapons, and it is going to be a major and ongoing war. Israel is at war right now, and America stands strongly with Israel, and that's where we should be.
What's your response to those who are blaming Israel for this? And what is your response? Because some people believe as this war goes on and as Israel responds to try to take out Hamas, that they're going to be under pressure all of a sudden to stop. So,
well, look, I will say in times of crisis, character is revealed. You're right, there have been some left-wing Democrats in Congress who blamed Israel. There have been left-wing radical groups. There were, sadly, at my alma mater at Harvard, there were 34 student groups that put out a statement that said all of this violence is 100% Israel's fault. That is utterly bizarre. And I got to say, anyone who finds moral ambiguity, anyone who claims there's some justification, there's no justification for raping and killing children. There's no justification for decapitating babies. What they're doing here is horrific, and it is evil, period, full stop. Now, you talked about what's coming next, and you're right, this war is going to have significant casualties. And among those casualties are going to be Palestinian civilians. Here's the important thing to understand about that. The reason there will be Palestinian civilian casualties is because Hamas wants dead Palestinians. They use Palestinians as human shields. They locate, for example, their headquarters in the basement of a hospital, a Palestinian hospital, because they want to put the Israeli military in an impossible situation, where either they choose not to take out their military headquarters, that is launching terrorist attacks, which is a victory, or they do choose to take them out, in which case you have dead Palestinians, you have mothers as a maternity ward, you have mothers and infants that are killed as a result. In 2014, which was the last major rocket attack from Hamas on Israel, they did the same thing. They used Palestinians as human shields, and I led a bipartisan resolution in the Senate. I led it along with Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat from New York, and we authored a resolution condemning the use of human shields by Hamas as a war crime, because that's what it is. And they systematically, they place their rockets in kindergartens. And I want to draw a contrast because it's important to know. There's no military on earth that goes to greater lengths to avoid civilian casualties than the Israeli Defense Forces. They will literally, they have the cell phones of every person in Gaza. They are texting people saying, if you're a civilian, if you're not a combatant, avoid these places, evacuate these places. These are military targets. Don't be here. And I'll tell you, Hamas is telling the Palestinians, stay right where we are, right where you are, because we want your dead bodies for the news media to then blame that on Israel. It is horrific and it is wrong, and America needs to have the clarity to understand that Israel has a right to defend itself and a right to take out these terrorists. I want to tell you also, Jack, one of the most disturbing things about what's happening. This terror attack, in a very, very real way, was paid for by Joe Biden and the Biden administration. In the last 2.5 years, the Biden administration has flowed more than $50 billion to Iran. Hamas.
How so?
How so?
Explain that.
Yeah, so there are 4 buckets of money that have gone to Iran, and Hamas works for Iran. Iran planned this attack, Iran funded this attack, Iran is directing this attack. There were 4 different buckets of cash that have gone and funded this attack. Number one, many people have talked about the $6 billion. Just in recent weeks, the Biden administration negotiated an agreement where they agreed to pay $6 billion in exchange for 5 Americans being released as hostages. Now, at the time, I said that was a terrible decision because they were effectively placing a bounty on the head of every American. They were setting a price of $1.2 billion per American. And I predicted at the time the result of that will be more of our enemies will take Americans hostage and Iran will take more hostages. I didn't know it would be just a couple of weeks later. We have more than 20 American hostages now that Iran has taken, Hamas has taken. And that, I think, was incentivized by the $6 billion. But the $6 billion is just the tip of the iceberg. Several weeks earlier, the Biden administration released $10 billion that had been frozen from Iraq. They released that to Iran, to the regime. So that upped the total to $16 billion. But even that is not the biggest portion. When Joe Biden came into office, the Iranian economy was in shambles. The Iranian regime was on its knees. And the reason is their major source of revenue is oil sales. And we have in place very tough oil sanctions that had shut down their oil sales. And I had spent the entire Trump presidency urging President Trump to vigorously enforce those sanctions. He did, and it crippled the Iranian economy. Joe Biden came in and he immediately stopped enforcing the oil sanctions. As a result, today, Iran is selling 2 million barrels of oil a day. It is funding this war. That has been over $40 billion that Joe Biden has allowed Iran to make from oil sales. They're selling it principally to China, so it's benefiting Iran and China, and that is what is paying for this attack. And there's also a 4th bucket, Jack. So the beginning of the Biden administration wanted to send hundreds of millions of dollars to the Gaza Strip. I led a coalition of senators, 17 senators, urging the administration, do not do this. Because, as I told them, if you do this, that money will go to Hamas, and Hamas will use it to carry out acts of terror against Israel. This was eminently predictable. Well, at the same time that 17 senators joined with me saying don't send the money to the Gaza Strip, 145 House Democrats, including Colin Allred, sent a letter to the Biden administration saying, do send the money. Send hundreds of millions of dollars to the Gaza Strip. Even though that money will go to Hamas and go to terrorism, we want you to send it anyway. And we now know what the Biden administration did with those 2 letters. They assessed the situation, and their conclusion was that, and this is their words, there was a high likelihood the money would go to Hamas and be used for terrorism. And nonetheless, they waived U.S. anti-terrorism laws. You know, it's against the law to send money if you know it's likely to be used for terrorism. And so they waived that law because politically they wanted to send that money to the Gaza Strip even though they knew Hamas would use it for terrorism. And tragically, that's exactly what's happened.
A lot of other topics to talk about, so let me talk about this letter that you sent to President Biden today regarding the border and these 4 bridge projects between Texas and Mexico. What's the issue?
Well, my number one priority is jobs, and I think the number one priority of Texans across our state is jobs. There are 4 bridge projects in South Texas that are either building new bridges or expanding existing bridges. So there are 2 bridge projects in Laredo, there's one in Brownsville, there's one in Eagle Pass. All 4 of the projects have been caught in bureaucratic delays. They have been held up by the Biden administration. And the reason is, if you're going to build a bridge anywhere, if you're going to build a bridge in Dallas, you have to go through what's called NEPA environmental review. That's part of standard federal law. However, if you're going to build a bridge across a border, across an international border, you have to separately get a permit from the President of the United States. Now, the prior practice had been the President would grant that permit conditional on the completion of the NEPA review. So you'd get your permit, you'd do the NEPA review, you'd build the bridge. When Biden came in, he reversed that. And he announced the President would grant no permits whatsoever to build bridges across borders until after the NEPA review was entirely complete. The effect of that is to delay every one of these bridge projects 2, 3, 4 years. And I first learned about this about 2 years ago when the city leaders of Laredo came and met with me in Washington. And most of them are Democrats, and they were very upset. Why is the Biden administration delaying these projects? These projects are incredibly important. So I've been leading the fight to get these bridges built. I brought together a coalition of all of the South Texas congressional members. So several months ago, I sent a letter to the administration. I wrote it. It was joined by John Cornyn. It was joined by Henry Cuellar, a Democrat, Monica Dela Cruz, a Republican, Vicente Gonzalez, a Democrat, and Tony Gonzalez, a Republican. All of us joined the letter calling on the administration, end these bureaucratic delays, build these bridges. The administration unfortunately told all of us, go jump in a lake. So what I did is I authored legislation in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, on which I serve, that mandates that these bridges be accelerated, that the approval process move faster. And that legislation, what it does is sets a 60-day time clock, that the President has 60 days to grant the permits, and if he doesn't, the permits are deemed granted automatically by operation of law. My legislation got bipartisan support on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then in July was passed on the floor of the Senate with overwhelming bipartisan support. So that legislation is expected to be signed into law before the end of the year. But today, what I did is reassembled that congressional coalition, calling on the Biden administration and saying, look, don't delay, approve these bridges. Because I got to tell you, Jack, the impact on Texas trade with Mexico every year is roughly $800 billion a year. Building and expanding these bridges means thousands of new jobs in the state of Texas. It means billions of dollars of new economic activity. It benefits Texas farmers, Texas ranchers, Texas manufacturers, Texas small businesses. It's unambiguously good for Texas, for commerce, and it is only the bureaucratic knuckleheadedness of the administration that is slowing it down. And so I'm hopeful they'll change their path, and if they don't, the legislation that I passed will go into effect by the end of the year.
You're running for re-election.
Yeah.
What is the basis of your re-election campaign? Why should Texans re-elect you?
Because what we're doing in Texas is working. Texas is a success story for the country. There's a reason 1,000 people a day come to the state of Texas every single day. My top 3 priorities are jobs, freedom, and security. And I think that's what Texans want. Jobs, we want low taxes and reasonable regulations so that small businesses can grow and prosper and create new jobs. We want freedom. We want our constitutional rights protected. We want free speech and religious liberty in the Second Amendment, the basic rights of every American protected. And we want security. We care about our families. That means supporting law enforcement, standing up against violent criminals. We're seeing crime rates rising across the country as you're seeing Democrats trying to defund the police. That doesn't make any sense, and it means securing the border. Jack, what's happening on our southern border is an absolute catastrophe. It's a humanitarian catastrophe. It's a national security catastrophe. I have been leading the fight every day that I've been in the Senate to secure the border, and what Joe Biden and the Democrats have done, and every congressional Democrat has voted for this, is open the border entirely. We have over 7.6 million people who've crossed illegally into America, most of them into Texas. And it is an absolute disaster. And so my priorities are jobs, freedom, and security. And I'll point out also, when it comes to delivering for Texas, I've authored and passed 94 separate pieces of legislation that have been fighting for jobs, for freedom, for security, things like that bridge legislation that are creating thousands of jobs in Texas. And my job every day is to fight for 30 million Texans.
Two other questions I want to get in here, and that is the Democratic candidates running against you. They criticize you because of your podcast.
Yeah.
They say you're too busy podcasting instead of representing Texans. And they criticized your decision to go to Mexico back during the 2021 storm. So how do you respond to that?
Well, look, it is hardly news that Democrats are attacking me. They're going to continue doing that. They've got a political campaign to run, and so they're going to have nasty attacks every single day, and they're going to scream insults. I can tell you my approach to this campaign is going to be the same as it has been to every campaign, which is I'm focused on issues and substance and results. I'm focused on what Texans want. I'm focused on jobs and freedom and security, so I'm not interested in playing an insult game with Democrat candidates. And I got to say, the podcast attack I find really amusing. So I do a podcast every week, as you know. It's 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. It's called Verdict with Ted Cruz. We have just under 1 million unique listeners that listen to it every day. You know, the podcast this week, I did one on Monday, I did one on Wednesday. Both of them focused on Israel. Both of them did a deep dive into what's happening in Israel. What is happening, what caused it. Both of them explained in great detail all of the funding sources that have gone to funding this terror attack from Hamas on Israel. Both of them also went into what's coming next, what are going to be the next steps, what's going to happen when Hezbollah gets more involved, what does that mean for Israel, what's going to happen with Iran. And so I walk through the great issues of the day. The podcast is an integral part of my job, which is communicating with 30 million Texans, communicating with the people across America about the issues I'm fighting on. That's exactly what my job is, and I find it a bizarre notion that their criticism is, well, you know, he talks to the people of Texas too much, he engages with them on the issues too much. That's exactly what I'm elected to do, which is to lead and fight for Texans, and that's what I'm going to keep doing.
So, Senator, let me ask you, right now in Texas, the Republican Party is fractured.
Yeah.
We've seen it since the impeachment trial
Yeah.
of the Attorney General. What do you make of all this animosity between the Lieutenant Governor and the House Speaker, and how concerned are you about the ability to govern here in Texas with all that animosity?
Yeah, listen, I'm very worried about it. I don't like, there are very real tensions within the Republican Party in Texas. The impeachment of Ken Paxton, I didn't agree with the impeachment. I came out publicly and urged the legislature not to impeach Ken. But as far as I'm concerned, that's done. What I don't like seeing, you're right, the Lieutenant Governor and the Speaker of the House are in open warfare. That's not good for Texas. It's not good for the Republican Party. What I'm urging is both sides, put down your guns. Don't engage in a battle, and I've been spending a lot of time urging both sides, come together, let's focus on accomplishing real results for the people of Texas. And I got to say, right now is particularly critical. The legislature's in special session. We have the best opportunity ever to pass historic school choice legislation, to give every child in Texas the right to access a quality education, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, their wealth, their zip code. This is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. This is my number one domestic priority, is school choice, fighting for kids to have access to an excellent education. And I'm worried that we could blow school choice in Texas because of this civil war within the Republican Party. And so I've urged both sides, stop battling each other and start fighting together to accomplish the results we need. And I'll tell you, you know, in state legislative races, it's interesting. U.S. senators generally stay out of primaries in their own state. You know, as far as I know, I'm the only senator who doesn't do that. There are 100 of us, 99 of my colleagues stay out of primaries in their own state, to the best of my knowledge. I regularly engage in primaries in the state of Texas, and I'll tell you why I do so. So every cycle I sit down and I have my team prepare an Excel spreadsheet. And on that spreadsheet is every vote that a state rep or a state senator has cast on school choice. And I've made very public, if you voted in favor of school choice and you're otherwise relatively conservative, you're quite likely to get my support. But if you haven't, if you voted against school choice, the chances of my supporting you are essentially zero. And the odds are significant. I'm going to support your opponent. I'm going to endorse your primary opponent. And when I do that, I don't do so gently. I come in, I cut radio ads, I cut TV ads. And, we had last cycle 7 runoffs. And I engaged in those runoffs, and you had a whole bunch of money from the teachers' unions fighting against school choice on one side. I was on the other. We won a majority of those races. Now, the reason I do that, look, the reason most of my colleagues don't get in primaries is because you're hurting yourself politically. There's an old line that when you make an endorsement like that, you get half their friends and you get all their enemies. And so it hurts. Every time I make an endorsement, I am knowingly hurting myself politically. But I'm doing it because I think school choice matters too much. And my hope is that this is a carrot and a stick. And as the legislature is meeting in Austin, I hope the fact that I'm going to make endorsements based on what they do will encourage them to do the right thing. Because if we end this year with giving millions of kids in Texas access to excellent education, giving them the ability to choose. If you're at a great public school, fantastic, you may choose to go there. But if you're at a school that is not teaching you that violence, there's violence in the hallways and drug dealers in the streets and their children getting assaulted in the bathrooms, you ought to have a right to pick another school. And this is about giving low-income Texans the same rights the rich have always had. Wealthy parents, if the school is not performing, they can move their kid. School choice is about saying, even if you're not rich, your kid deserves an education. I got to say, I know in my family, my dad came from Cuba in 1957 with nothing. He couldn't speak English. It was education. My dad came to go to the University of Texas, and he got an education. He built a small business. Today, he's a pastor. Education is the gateway to the American dream. And so I am passionate that every kid in Texas deserves an excellent education. And so my hope is that the tensions in the Republican Party don't get in the way of an historic opportunity to deliver for the kids of Texas.
Senator Ted Cruz, thank you so much.
Thank you, John.